Good afternoon and welcome to Broadcasting Scotland and this week's Full Scottish. My name is Isla Barker. On the programme this week, we are delighted to be joined in the studio by Marion Fellows. Good afternoon, Marion.
Afternoon, Isla.
And we are also delighted to welcome Hugh Marshall from Talking Wales, joining us remotely. Good morning, Hugh. Afternoon, Hugh.
Good afternoon.
To start, we will begin with our Ukraine update. Russian troops are inching towards the city of Konstantinivka in Ukraine's eastern Donetsk region, trying to establish a foothold close to a heavily defended area, Alexander Siersky, Ukraine's top army official said on Saturday. Konstantinivka, along with other cities, forms a so-called fortress belt in the country's east, a highly fortified Ukrainian military area. On Saturday, Russia's defense ministry said it had seized the village of Myrovpila in Ukraine's southern Sumy region, where Moscow says it wants to establish a buffer zone. The Kursk group of the Ukrainian military, writing on Facebook, dismissed the Russian report as a complete lie and said its units controlled the area. 2 people were killed and 7 wounded after a Russian drone attacked a minibus in the southern Ukrainian city of Kherson, local officials said on Saturday. On Ukraine's Black Sea coast, a Russian strike damaged port infrastructure in the city of Odessa, but no casualties were reported. Donald Trump's announcement of plans to withdraw 5,000 U.S. troops from Germany, including a Biden-era plan to deploy a U.S. battalion with long-range Tomahawk missiles, is being seen as a blow to Berlin and NATO, which had been pushing for a more powerful deterrent against Russia. The U.S. announcement could spur Europe to strengthen its own defenses, German Defense Minister Boris Pistorius said on Saturday, but 2 top U.S. Republican lawmakers warned against U.S. troops leaving Europe. North Korean leader Kim Jong-un met delegates to the ruling party's Youth League Congress in Pyongyang, as the North Korean government has again cast young people as central to both domestic mobilization and its military role in Russia's war against Ukraine. The 11th Congress of the Socialist Patriotic Youth League is a once-in-5 years political gathering aimed at mobilizing citizens aged roughly 14 to 30. North Korea has sent an estimated 14,000 troops to fight alongside Russian forces in the war against Ukraine. Now on to our Middle East update. 831 Palestinians have been killed in Gaza since the start of the October 2025 ceasefire, bringing a total number of Palestinians killed in Gaza since October 7, 2023 to 72,611. The Israeli military continues its offensive in Lebanon despite the ceasefire, bombing and demolishing towns and villages along the border, taking the death toll in Lebanon to 2,659. We at Broadcasting Scotland believe that abusing, attacking and killing people because of their ethnic or religious background is completely wrong. Religious bigotry has been a blight in Scotland, and we have witnessed the effects of genocide in Bosnia, and we stand fully against anti-Semitism. Human rights are universal, and as humans we must defend equal rights for all. And so, Marion,
Yes.
With religious bigotry and danger in Scotland, how will, for example, the attack in Golders Green impact safety in Scotland, for example, in the community?
One has to assume that the police are aware of what's happening and are putting things in place to mitigate anything that could happen. And I think it's really important to say that it's how people feel that matters. It doesn't necessarily always imply that you have to be attacked before you feel scared. And we have had attacks, not many in Scotland, but we have a lot of anti-Semitism all across the UK. Less, I hope, in Scotland, but there's no proof of that. And the continuous and continual pushing forward of this, and the Israeli attacks on Gaza, which many people in Scotland are really, really concerned about, is only going to fuel this fire. What we need are community leaders working together to make sure that anti-Semitism is seen as the scourge it is.
Thank you. And Hugh, have you seen an increase in anti-Semitism in Wales in recent years or months?
We're quite fortunate in Wales where we don't have a history of sectarianism, and we have very small Jewish population. There were larger sort of Jewish communities in the valleys during the Industrial Revolution, when the coal industry, but it has lessened in years gone by. But we find, there are examples of, hate crimes happening across Wales, unfortunately, but they do tend to be mainly focused on people of Islamic faith and black people.
See, and so the Prime Minister has announced that there may be plans to restrict certain protests. Do you think, what impacts do you think this can have on not only freedom of speech, but also anti-Semitism or Islamophobia?
Yeah, I think it's really important. I think it's really important, as you said at the beginning of the program, there's no ifs or buts. We have to call out all kinds of bigotry and racism. Whether that's towards the Jewish community or Muslim community, Protestant, Catholic, whatever. But there's no tolerance for that. But the narrative around this, of people describing these marches as hate marches, I think people have to be careful with the language, because I think it is important that people march in solidarity with the people of Palestine, Lebanon, in Gaza and the West Bank, because they are being terrorised, by the Israeli state. And it's really important that we separate the state, the machine behind this, who are committing these crimes, and ordinary Jewish people. And it's good to see many Jewish people calling out, the crimes of the Israeli government. But it is a sensitive subject, but language is really important. And I think that there is a danger that of stopping marches, because I believe that they want to try and stop the march that's happening this month or early next month, and the same day Tommy Robinson is having a march, protesting against God knows who. So it'll be interesting to see, if they try and stop his march as well.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. And Marion, how do you think this will impact protest in the UK or anti-Semitism and Islamophobia?
Well, I really believe that everything that Hugh has said is absolutely correct, and hate crime has to be stopped. But one of the ways to stop it is not to give up freedom of speech. It's really a difficult balancing act. I think any government anywhere who acts as a result of something that has just happened is on a hiding to nothing, basically, because they haven't had the time to actually look at things, they haven't had the time to really prepare. And if we have a knee-jerk reaction to what's happened in Golders Green, which was absolutely despicable, should never happened, but it did. If we have a knee-jerk reaction to that and to the Manchester incident at the synagogue in Manchester, then we're not going to have good law. We're not going to actually help the situation, I feel. I think we need to take a breath, think very hard about freedom of speech, and to think very hard about putting things into law that will, in the long run, affect every single member of every single community.
Thank you. And so what could the police and government do instead of restricting protests to protect people?
I think they will have to have some restrictions, but what I'm actually saying is that you cannot just do it knee-jerk right now. I think every demonstration, every march, everything has to be taken on a singular basis. You have to look at what's happening, and you have to bear in mind, as Hugh has already said, there are a number of Jewish people already on these marches who don't think they're hate marches against Jews, who are not anti-Semitic, and we have to really get the message across. It's a very difficult job, I make no bones about that, but I think rushing headlong into a solution is not going to give us the right answer.
Thank you. And Hugh, how do you think the government and police can protect people during this period of uncertainty without restricting protest or freedom of demonstration?
It is difficult, but hopefully, I think what's important with any march, of protest and solidarity is that people within those marches self-police and call out people who are there, sort of preaching hate and trying to incite violence. Unfortunately, they are there, but they are a minority. But I think it's important that that they're called out and not made welcome on these marches. So I think there's a duty on us to police that as well.
Thank you. And moving on from freedom of speech to World Press Freedom. On World Press Freedom Day, it is more important than ever to support independent journalism as a vital element in Scotland's democracy. As BBC cost-cutting could see 2,000 jobs go, with the highest proportion coming from BBC News, what will the cuts mean for Scotland and Wales? So, Marion, these job cuts, they can impact press freedom, obviously, but what is the extent of these impacts, do you think?
I think it's going to have a huge impact, although there are many people who would argue that the loss of BBC Scotland would not be a huge matter of in Scotland in terms of political reporting. But I think that's just taking a one-sided approach. I think we really need to make sure that Scotland has a thriving and diverse broadcasting and news system gathering. The fact that international observers have noted that it's very strange that in Scotland there's only one newspaper that supports the independence movement, which is coming towards 50-50 and above in some polls. And that is something that the Scottish government, although I don't believe that government should interfere, but any Scottish administration, any broadcasting or journalist newspaper business in Scotland really has to be aware of what the people of Scotland need and want, and I don't think that's necessarily been the case in the past. Newspapers have always been biased one way or t'other, and that's just a fact of life. So I don't know what the answer is. I'm not in the journalistic profession, but I do know from a political point of view it's really important. And to stop hate speech and all the other things we've been talking about this morning, we need an unbiased media, and that's not what we have at the moment.
Thank you. And Hugh, these BBC job cuts, how do you think they could impact Wales, and not just Welsh BBC jobs, but other journalistic jobs in Wales?
Yeah, I think it's interesting. These announcements are coming at a time when obviously a new Director General, whose background is with Google, is coming in. It's a time where the need for independent, verifiable news has never been so important. And as you've just been saying, the position in Scotland, is slightly different to Wales, where we don't have any national newspapers. We have local newspapers across Wales. And the BBC is quite dominant. Radio 2, for example, is the most popular radio station in Wales, and the Daily Mail and the Sun are two of the most popular newspapers, although the power of newspapers has diminished in recent years as social media has become more dominant. But yeah, we need greater media plurality. That's why I set up Talking Wales, and obviously that's why Broadcasting Scotland exists, because there is a need for more independent voices, and it'll be interesting to see what this current UK government are doing to support sort of local independent news. It does seem to be focused on England, their plans, but it'll be interesting to see how the two new devolved governments that emerge on next Friday will look at news provision, and hopefully start looking at it. It's not just a case of supporting an industry. It's vital for democracy that people are kept informed, because the amount of misinformation that is out there, the amount of people who are taking forming their political views based on things they're reading on Facebook, Instagram, and increasingly TikTok, is alarming. And unless governments invest in services that can counter that, we're heading for dangerous times. Because I think looking at the rise of reform, they've benefited greatly from social media platforms, sharing misinformation.
Thank you. And so, Marion, in terms of individual action, how do you think individual people can protect and support press freedom?
I think it's really important. I think we might have to go right back to schools. And when I taught in colleges, we did try during communication lessons, not necessarily me myself, but to actually encourage and enable students to understand what was true and what wasn't, and that has become a thousand times more difficult. And as Hugh said, social media is where most people are now getting their news, and that's probably as a failure, but also because social media actually targets people and targets their views and enhances and really goes full tilt to make sure that what they think is what they should be thinking, and it becomes very, very 1984, people's minds being controlled. UK government has tried, because Scottish government has no power over media, have tried through their various acts recently to make things better. But I think we can already see that more and more and more needs to be done, because the power of the social media giants is far greater, and they have far more resources than do governments across the world, in fact. So I think we really need to try, and in education, to teach children and adults forever, that to actually understand that not just because something is written down and they might agree with it, that's not necessarily the truth. And I mean, I don't know of a way, and I don't know of any country yet that has managed to do that. Look at Donald Trump in the States. I mean, fake news, he talks about fake news the whole time, but then he produces quite a lot of fake news himself. So how does the world, in fact, go ahead with this? I'm not totally pessimistic, but I think there's a lot more work needs to be done.
Of course, thank you. And Hugh, so in not only daily life, but in local communities or in national communities, how could people defend press freedom and support press freedom?
I think Marion's point about education, in school and beyond, because I think it's a key part of it. It is part of the curriculum in Wales, but teachers are under pressure to teach their own subjects, and having that the ability to deliver political education is a challenge. So the education system needs support in that space. I think the other thing that's important is, we go back and talk about, the newspapers, 20 years ago, there was, in South Wales Valleys, 20,000 copies of a weekly newspaper would be sold. It's literally down to a couple of hundred a week now. So that infrastructure has gone, from a community use perspective. But also those newspapers used to have offices in every town across Wales and Scotland. Those have closed down, and many of these companies now, so NewsQuest, who publish the National in Scotland, along with a couple of other titles, they're centralising a lot of their activity to England, and a lot of their content is being generated centrally in England. So I think, how do we bring back, sort of news rooms and spaces within the community? And I think, there's potential there to make use of empty spaces, help encourage people back into towns by actually having community news spaces. There's a brilliant example in Govanhill in Glasgow, so Greater Govanhill Community Newsroom, community newspaper that's co-created with the community there. So so there are models that can be used, and it's interesting to see that Scotland is leading the way in that sector.
Thank you very much. Now, Sir Keir Starmer may have survived a vote in the House of Commons this week, but how long will he survive after the elections this coming Thursday? So, Marion, do you think the recent scandal with the Peter Mandelson vetting will impact Labour's chances in the May 7 election?
I'm not sure is the answer to that. It's very interesting what people are taking from Westminster. I mean, I have a vested interest in Westminster, being a former MP. Even I hadn't been watching Parliament TV much. I've been glued to it in the last week or so with the committee investigating the Mandelson stuff. But how much of that is actually cutting through? how much of that is actually cutting through to the average punter in the street? And I'm not sure it is, but what is cutting through is that the Labour government isn't doing what they thought it would do when they voted for them in 2024. So that's really important. I think also that Labour, many Labour backbenchers are very unhappy and have been unhappy since day one. And there are people in the Labour Party, in the Cabinet, who are jockeying for position. And I think that's what will be Keir Starmer's downfall. I think he's not cutting through as a real live person. And I see now, the last time I heard him speak, he was talking about how terrible the international situation is. And that's the only place where he seems to the normal person to be making any difference whatsoever. So I think it's all to play for. I don't think there'll be good results, but we're only dealing with polls at the moment, and I know every politician says the poll that matters is the vote on the day, and that could still change. Even here in Scotland, it could still change. But we need to actually hold the UK government to account, because what they promised is not what they delivered. I think Starmer will stand in fright. I think it will get really messy. And in the meantime, who's running the United Kingdom government?
Right, thank you. And Hugh, do you think that the recent Peter Mandelson scandal and issues with the Prime Minister will impact the success of Labour in the upcoming election?
I don't think the Mandelson scandal per se is having. I think it's an accumulative effect. I think Labour really started losing their support when they, sort of cut the winter fuel allowance. They're disciplining their own MPs over the two-child cap. It was quite interesting hearing Starmer last week. I think he was addressing a workers' conference and saying, how he sort of scrapped the two-child cap and how important it was, without mentioning the fact that he disciplined his own MPs for standing up for it. Only a short while ago. I think Starmer, he's a dead man walking. He's, as Marion was saying, I think people think he does quite a good job on the international stage, but as a Prime Minister and as a communicator, he is just awful. And I think, it's, I think, he is harming Labour, and I think, he is a gift to the SNP and Plaid Cymru, because he is the gift that keeps giving. Their issue is who can replace it. You've got Wes Streeting, who I don't think is popular with the populace. He may be popular with the PLP. Angela Rayner I think she would be, a popular person across the UK, but obviously, her tax affairs, perhaps there's still a bit of a shadow being cast by that, and obviously Andy Burnham is the key figure, but obviously he needs to become an MP before he can become leader of the Labour Party. But it's not a matter of if, it's when. I think these results on Thursday will be hugely damaging for Starmer, and it'll make Mandelson, scandal pale into insignificance, because I can see, especially in England, Labour losing heavily to the Green Party, not Reform. Reform, obviously, they probably will do well, but I think they've hit a ceiling. But I think it's the people moving from Labour to Green, which is really going to harm Starmer. But yeah, they're a mess, basically. Their vote has collapsed in Wales. It's clearly not holding up well in Scotland. They were given a landslide in the number of MPs. It wasn't a landslide in terms of vote, and rather than using that huge majority to be progressive and put through some policies, they've botched it and made a mess of it from the economic point of view. And I think, having a Prime Minister and a Chancellor who were sort of, in lockstep with each other, and who are both, deeply unpopular, is a challenge for them. But we'll find out on Friday.
Thank you. And so, Marion, after what Hugh said, who do you think could or should replace Keir Starmer?
I was listening on the way in here this morning to the radio and heard the fact that the Labour NEC are not as against the knight from the north who's going to ride in and save them all. I think that's really, really interesting, because it was Starmer who stopped Andy Burnham becoming a candidate in the election, the by-election. And I think if the NEC are turning against Starmer as well, then we may well see Andy Burnham being a real challenge. But all of that will take time. And I think Starmer will probably hang on for a wee while. But I think he's, as Hugh said, he's a dead man walking. He's never really connected with the public mood in the country. I mean, starting off with all the scandal about glasses and suits and dresses, and then moving on to the kind of thing he did with Mandelson. I think the basic flaw in Starmer is he's not a politician. And he doesn't really understand that it's not what you do, it's the effect of what is perceived as the effect on the population that really is going to stymie you. I mean, it was so tenured. I mean, and Labour have a long track record, especially in Scotland, of just ignoring history and ignoring the truth. Labour MPs, especially folk like Brian Leishman in Grangemouth, were absolutely hammered because they voted to cut the two-child tax cap. And for example, my local MP is saying, isn't it wonderful that Labour have actually cut the two-child tax cap? That is nonsense, because they fought again. They were pushed kicking and screaming to do that, but now they're taking all the credit for it happening. And people are starting to see through it. They were prepared to, I think, give them a chance and think about things, and they're just in and but 2 years almost down the line, the people are not feeling better, they're not feeling better off, and they don't feel this government's working for them. So I do think Starmer's gone, but I'm not entirely convinced it will be quick, and I'm not entirely convinced that it will make government in the UK any better whatsoever.
So do you think there is any chance that Keir Starmer could salvage some public support in the next few months?
I think that's highly unlikely at the moment, the way things are. But then, what do they say? A week's a long time in politics. But I think there are too many people behind the scenes actually jockeying for his position for it to be any way viable for him in the longer term.
Thank you. And Hugh, do you think Keir Starmer has a chance to stay on longer or even gain some more public support?
No, as Marion pointed out, he just can't. He doesn't connect with people, and he's shown over the last couple of years that he just doesn't have that ability to connect with people. And if you haven't got that ability, and it's a sad thing to say, but personality is a big part of politics. Is why Farage is so popular, with a certain demographic, because he is an excellent communicator and is excellent communicating with that specific audience. Whereas Starmer, and I would include Badenoch as well in that, are just awful communicators, speaking to people. I think Davey is better at it from a Lib Dem perspective in England, and Plansky as well to a certain extent. But I think people underestimate the ability of John Swinney and Rhyd ap Iorwerth to communicate with the public. And we've seen that in Wales, that sort of how Rhyd ap Iorwerth is received by people is he is very well received because he's an excellent communicator.
Thank you. Now, following the King's US visit, Donald Trump announced he was removing tariffs on whiskey. He said he was doing it in honour of the King and acknowledged representations made by First Minister John Swinney. On Friday, Broadcasting Scotland visited the Deanston distillery, where John Swinney was in attendance to celebrate the removal of tariffs on whiskey. How will SNP policies positively affect Scottish industries such as whiskey?
Well, the big thing, even just recently, we've had the news from the US about the abolition of whisky tariffs. Now, that's something that John Swinney has been leading on, with some criticism, I have to say, from some elements of the political spectrum, that he was dealing with the US to actually engage and take the argument seriously. So it was really significant news that we got those tariffs lifted. That's great news for the whole of the industry.
On Friday, we joined John Swinney on his campaign visit to Deanston Distillery on the banks of the River Teith as he welcomed the decision by US President Donald Trump to remove import tariffs on Scotch whisky. Obviously, you're very pleased with the removal of whisky tariffs, so what has brought about this change and how will it impact the Scottish whisky industry?
I'm delighted that President Trump has removed the tariffs on Scotch whisky. This is a very welcome step because the tariffs were doing damage to jobs and employment within Scotland. And what's brought this about is the putting forward of a route through this, which is about recognising the economic damage to the Scotch whisky industry, but also the economic damage done to the industry, the bourbon industry in Kentucky. And what I advanced to President Trump was a proposal that would resolve both of those issues by the removal of tariffs. And I'm delighted that in his message last night, he has cited the significance of that particular proposal in his thinking to remove tariffs.
How would an independent Scotland affect daily life in comparison to a devolved government?
What independence allows Scotland to do is to take the wide range of decisions on the economy, on the issues around tackling poverty, about our international representation and engagement, particularly our participation in the European Union. And for all these reasons, independence gives Scotland the ability to build on the self-government we already exercise under devolution and to make sure that we transform people's lives as a consequence.
How is the campaign going?
Well, it feels pretty good. The party's getting a good response. A lot of people who might have voted Labour at the last election to get rid of the Tories, they wanted change. They've not liked the change that Westminster delivered, so they're asking questions about independence in a way that's really quite significant. I think that they're coming to us for the day-to-day, here and now cost of living issues, but there is a bigger agenda with the SNP. We want an independent Scotland in Europe. I think that's the answer. So a lot of people are coming to us on that basis.
For voters who are unsure about independence, how would you convince them to vote for the SNP? And do you think your campaign has inspired pro-independence voters to vote for the SNP?
It's very clear that there's a growing support for independence in Scotland, and as a consequence of the SNP campaign focusing very heavily on independence, our support is rising during this election campaign, as demonstrated by the opinion polls. So there is very clear evidence that the campaign that we have designed of relating independence directly to the daily lives of people in Scotland, particularly in questions such as the cost of living, is a significant factor in attracting more support to the SNP.
So, of course, the whisky tariffs were greatly impacting Scottish industry. So then, Hugh, in the case that Wales gains independence, what industries could Wales bring to the world stage or to Europe as a whole?
We have got a whisky industry, funnily enough. Penderyn whisky is one of the success stories of recent years in Wales, and there were whisky distilleries across Wales, but unlike in Scotland, the religion sort of basically put paid to it, with people going to chapel, 4 times on a Sunday. Back in the day, fire and brimstone. It put paid to a lot of those industries. I think for Wales, obviously, being a specialist in certain areas is challenging. We've tried to grow sort of industries around, things like cybercrime and fintech. I think we need to develop a new economic model. I think that the big growth sectors for Wales are going to be around energy, green energy, and the use of water. So obviously, like Scotland, we've got an abundance of energy and water, and how do we use those for our benefit? Because I think at the moment, especially with green energy, a lot of the energy infrastructure in Wales is owned by companies not just outside Wales but outside of the UK. Lots of them are German, Scandinavian companies. So I think we need to look at developing our own capacity to be building wind turbines and technologies in the sea to harness the powers of tides and waves, and I think that's something that Wales is looking to develop in the future.
Thank you. So, trade and foreign policy is obviously a reserved power in Scotland. So, in the possibility of an SNP majority and gaining independence, how could the gaining of power over trade policy impact Scottish industries?
Well, I think that's quite an easy one to answer. I mean, Alan Smith referred to the EU as well. We wouldn't have to start from the bottom up. We already have worldwide exports. We already have the kinds of industries here. We've got the energy, and we've got whisky, and we've got a lot of financial firms as well, other industries, and quite a thriving small business sector. I think independence gives us the levers, the way forward in conjunction with Europe to actually get back out into the world and be the kind of nation that we were for hundreds of years before we joined the Union. Now, that's too much history, I suppose. But going forward, I think people have underestimated John Swinney and what he is able to do internationally, speaking to Trump and actually finding the thing that really helped get the tariff removed on whisky was to say to Trump, look, it's a benefit to Americans here, a benefit to Kentucky, to bourbon makers. That's how he got the tariff removed. And I think that kind of knowledge and investment in what we are doing in Scotland, I think that can only increase going forward. I think we get unfettered. We don't get held down. We don't get told we can't do things. We are able to do things. Look at Ireland. Look at, I will use Ireland especially. Ireland was much, much poorer for a long time than Scotland. Look at it now. It's not a poor country. We have the same kind of drive. We have the entrepreneurs. Perhaps not Malcolm Offord, but we have lots of entrepreneurs who would seize the opportunities that an independent Scotland would give. Yes, there are qualms and people are not entirely sure, but I think that once we get the independence and once people realise we are serious world players in exports, then I think things will improve. For example, energy. It will help people locally. It will help people in Scotland with lower energy bills. We were promised that with GB Energy. We were promised so much by GB Energy, by the Labour Party. None of it has come to pass. We have the energy in Scotland. We can be 100% self-sufficient. We have the water as they have in Wales. And I think that that's really the two main areas at the moment where we can actually see a path forward, and there are many others that businesses in Scotland have been working towards for years and years and years.
Thank you. And so, Hugh, back to the Welsh industries, how could an independent Wales really I suppose, put itself out there in the world stage and really make a name for itself?
Yeah, I think, as Marion pointed out, I think one of the key things is being part of the EU, because obviously, Brexit has been a clear and unmitigated disaster, as many of us predicted it would be. So I think having that direct route into the EU, so Wales, for example, we rely a lot on export of red meat, mainly sort of lamb, but also beef, and that industry is worth just under £1 billion a year, which is over a third of sort of the Welsh farming economy. So obviously, sort of cutting down those barriers to trade. Can make a huge difference. And the other thing that I think we forget is the cooperation between sort of learning institutions, universities, which thankfully is coming back to a certain extent with Erasmus. But we've lost a lot of that cooperation across different sectors. So I think having been back in the EU and being independent and having the fiscal levers to deliver change, but there is this feeling that Wales it's too small, too wee to go alone. But when you look at other countries that are smaller than Wales and of similar sizes as Wales, Scotland, and and we have higher GDPs. So it's clear that it is feasible. Independence is possible, and it's normal. But we're in a unique situation where we're in a partner of N equals 84% of the UK population live in England. So basically, the UK basically is England. Wales, Scotland, and Northern Ireland, where add-ons, like the noisy little siblings. But I think the key thing is obviously independence will give us the levers to do our own thing economically, and being part of the EU would benefit us greatly.
So do you think Wales should adopt the euro if they are welcomed into the EU?
Oh, now you're opening a whole new can of worms there.
Right.
Back in the day, there were many of the banks were actually formed based in Wales. So Lloyds Bank, the Black Horse. The reason for that was obviously people in a number of years ago were innumerate, but they could visualize things. So a banknote with a different number of horses or sheep on, they could understand that. So we had our own currency. So the Bank of the Black Sheep, you can still see where that bank was in Aberystwyth. So I would bring back the Welsh sheep pound personally.
Right, thank you. And moving on to the Scottish and Welsh elections. In the last week of the elections in Scotland and Wales, it is becoming clear that turnout and tactical voting will be major factors in the results. So, Marion, in Scotland, what do you think tactical voting could look like, especially in the Highlands and Islands, the borders, or the north of Scotland?
Well, tactical voting would be for unionist parties to agree, not formally, but for unionist voters actually, to decide that they want to keep the SNP out. And that may well be the case. But interestingly, this morning, I also was reading that voters who vote for reform are much less likely to tactically vote. They will actually vote for reform come hell or high water. Mm-hmm. Now, that might be an advantage to to the SNP, but it may not be the advantage that we hope for. I think things are although polls tell us a good story, I don't think there's anyone in the SNP sitting going, well, that's it, we're sorted. Of course we're not. I think SNP needs to move forward. But I think there may well be some Labour voters, for example, who realise they have no chance. Will they vote Conservative? Will they vote Reform? Will they vote anyone else, Lib Dem? Any other unionist parties simply to keep the SNP out? And who knows? Because there isn't enough work, there hasn't been enough work done on that. And it all very much depends on the day. And as far as voter turnout, you can rest assured that where possible, the larger parties will be trying to get their voters out. And I think Labour might have more difficulty in doing that because people are so disgusted, so upset. They're either for Starmer or they're not, mainly not. They mainly see that Labour really hasn't got much of a chance, and things have got to the ridiculous stage over some things. So I think it's all to play for. I think getting our vote out, getting any party's vote out is going to be absolutely vital. And I think possibly out of all the parties, the SNP has the experience and knows how to do that, because they also, although they don't have as many activists, I think they have more than the other parties, and I think that may be key on the day.
Thank you. And so, Hugh, you've mentioned not only on today's Full Scottish, but on previous weeks, that people are afraid of reform and they want to keep them out. But you've also said that it looks like they might do quite well. So how do you think they will fare in the election?
Yeah, I think it's quite interesting. I think that it's interesting. Reform voters are, I think, unique. I think we saw with the Brexit vote, there were people who don't normally vote because they don't like the politics of any of the parties they see. So that they've got a cohort of people who don't normally vote. But what's interesting is a lot of people who support reform aren't actually registered because they don't understand that you need to be registered to vote. In Wales, it's a slightly different to Scotland because we've gone with a different system where previously we had the constituencies then they top up with the regional lists like you have in Scotland. In Wales this time we've got a closed list system, so basically 16 constituencies, each electing 6 Senedd members, and it's based on the haunt system. I won't try and explain it because it is a little bit complicated, but basically every 12% you get means you get a Senedd member. So in lots of these places, it's that 6th seat. Whether one of the smaller parties, like the Lib Dems, Greens, or Conservatives, can get to that sort of 10 to 12% mark in order to get that 6th seat. And I think what we're seeing is there's far more polarisation. In a way, Plaid support is basically coming largely from ex-Labour voters. We've heard from lots of people, people in their 80s who voted Labour all their lives, who are voting Plaid Cymru for the first time, people who don't support independence, supporting Plaid Cymru because they think that Labour have sort of let Wales down, but even Conservatives who dislike Farage to a point where if voting Plaid means there's going to be fewer Reform Senate members. So it's interesting where Plaid's vote is coming from. But what's interesting as well is it's the machinery of the Labour Party in Wales that seems to have collapsed as well. I was driving from, I live in Pontycymer, which is an ex-coal mining valley, and I travelled from here across the valleys to Pontypridd. And 20 years ago, when I moved down from North Wales, it would have been awash with Labour placards. I didn't see a single one, not even the local county councillor who's had one up outside their house at every election since I've been here. They haven't bothered this year. But it's interesting that the only placards you seem to be seeing are Plaid Cymru ones. And even a Reform supporter posted on a Facebook group asking where they can get Reform placards from because they were sick of only seeing Plaid Cymru ones. So obviously placards don't win elections. And we'll see on Friday, but hopefully I think the fear of Reform is big, the dislike of Farage is big, and even with those wavering Reform voters who want to change, I think what's happened in the last few weeks with Farage's best mate, Donald Trump, making the cost of fuel incredibly expensive is definitely going to harm him. It's interesting, Plaid Cymru using images of Farage with Trump on the last week of literature that's going out across Wales. So I think that is having an impact on them. But there are, Reform voters that, some of them are bizarre. They will just vote Reform. It doesn't matter what you tell them, they will vote Reform. And as somebody said last week, they were knocking on the door and they said, who are you voting for? They said Reform. And they said, well, can I ask you which of Reform's policies do you like? And the quite honest answer was the racist ones. So unfortunately, there is a core of people who like what Reform say, who want to send people back to where they came from. It's shocking, but they are there, and they do tend to be older people, and they do tend to be men who are angry. But it's weird. They're from a generation that had everything. They've got barely any sort of left on their mortgages. But yeah, it's weird. They don't want other people to have nice things for some reason.
Thank you. So Marion, the SNP has been in power for quite a while, so you've mentioned that the possibility of tactical voting for unionist parties to keep the SNP out could happen. So what do you think a unionist majority could look like for Scotland for the next few years?
Honestly, I think it would be awful. I think actually, as more and more people move towards the idea of independence and are looking at and seriously thinking about independence, a unionist would actually, in some sort of candid way, perhaps promote independence even more, because the way, and Hugh already said it, I forgot the percentage you used, but it's not a union of equals. It never has been a union of equals, and that's becoming more and more and more apparent. Tony Blair set up devolution because he thought, I can remember vividly standing in my kitchen listening to him saying, well, it will just be like parish councils. And of course that has not happened since the SNP took power. Scotland has become a country able to do much more on its own and willing to do much more on its own. But we always reach that barrier. I think it's really, really important that we don't return to the kind of patronising ways of unionist parties who will say, there, dear, there's your homework, there's your pocket money, spend it how you like, but we'll always have the final say in what you do. And I think that part of what's happened this time is people realise how much of a difference there is in Scotland as to England in terms of all the things that Scottish Government has done for people. Scottish SNP have been in power so long, people have forgotten in some cases and have been reminded quite a lot this campaign of all the things that they have simply because there's been an SNP government for 19 years. And that is really important. And I think that's really what we'll see people across the line. And I think that's why it's so important that people don't vote in unionist parties, because they'll take us backwards rather than forwards.
Thank you, Marion. Now, Hugh, you've said, and the polls do show that Plaid Cymru is gaining support. So do you think the demographics of Plaid Cymru voters have changed greatly in recent years, or have they steadily changed, stay the same?
Yeah, I think what's interesting, I'm of an age where I remember going out with my father, sort of knocking on doors for Plaid Cymru, and just basically having the door slammed in your face, and talking to lots of Plaid Cymru activists this time, who were knocking on doors and being warmly welcomed and being sort of given support. A lot of Plaid supporters are finding it very odd, because it's something they've never experienced before. But I think what's interesting as well, I think one of the things that's played well for Plaid is the promise that two Labour governments at each end of the M4 would bring greater prosperity, where in reality it hasn't happened. In fact, in certain cases, I think things are worse. So Labour in Westminster are trying to get more control over devolved matters rather than devolving more to Wales, even when their own Senedd members and the Welsh Labour Party have asked for it. They've been told, well, we know better than you, which is, which chimes with what Marion says, about unionist parties, because, England is their focus. I don't know if you saw Reform's party election broadcast that was for Wales, England and Scotland, that went out last week, and it was vote Reform to get Starmer out. So, there were a couple of shots of, locations in Wales and Scotland, but, it was basically, a pitch to English voters in their county council elections. So, it's clear that they've, Reform have got no interest in Wales and Scotland, only as sort of stepping stones to help them build some credibility in England. But yeah, definitely younger people, you look at the demographics, support for independence is much, much higher with, people under 25. And, support for Plaid Cymru is much, much higher with people under 25. When you go to the other end of the scale, over 65, they do tend to be more conservative reform and anti-independence. I think one of the things as well is obviously, Labour in Wales, their support came from, those heavy industries, from trade union movements with, coal and steel and slate. So with the demise of those industries, they've lost that thing. But I think the big thing that happened to Labour in Wales was Brexit. I think, sort of UKIP were basically, they were like a gateway out of Labour for those people who voted Labour but were basically socially conservative, a little bit racist, pro-hanging, sort of, law and order, a lot of people, out there of those views. So I think, that actually harmed them. And I think the fact that Plaid offer a progressive policy platform, people forget, and I think Keir Starmer forgets, actually it is quite popular to have good policies.
Thank you. Well, that is it for this week's Full Scottish. Before I go, I just want to remind you that at Broadcasting Scotland, we depend on the generosity of our supporters. To everyone who has donated and to everyone who has signed up to make a regularly monthly payment, thank you very much. We can only exist with your support. Our programmes will always be free to view. However, if you can afford £5 a month, please consider becoming a Broadcasting Scotland supporter, and please donate whatever you can afford. Thank you, and thank you again to our guests Marion Fellows and Hugh Marshall.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Goodbye, and thank you for watching.